It was the right game at the wrong time, and faded into obscurity, despite a solid concept. But after solidifying their identity after years of PlayStation floundering, it may be time for another stab. Join me today as we discuss the legacy of PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale and the potential for a second try. PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, or as I've sometimes jokingly called it, PlayStation Ball Scars. A 2012 game that was one of the more ill-conceived games in the history of the medium, because the entire thought process was likely, Nintendo is a long-running company that has Super Smash Bros., we're a long-running video game company, we should have our own version. They clearly didn't think it through further than that, and it came and went and nobody really seemed to care. And honestly, why should they? The roster was woeful, the content was slightly anemic, and it was obviously just made for the sake of having their own version of Super Smash Bros. But really, I don't think it's an idea without merit. They are absolutely a company with enough history and pedigree to justify something like this. With that said, I also think that it was just the worst possible time to bring out a Sony Smash Bros. Because it was during a time when PlayStation was having a bit of an identity crisis. The brand was at a point where it was transitioning between what it was in its early days and what it is now. Stick with me here, I'm going to be taking the scenic route to get to my point, but a point I definitely have. Back in the days of the PS1, the PlayStation was largely successful off the back of its cheaper price point compared to its competitors and its accessibility to third-party developers. It's no wonder that pretty much every single game associated with the console that people still remember to this day weren't owned or made by Sony. Resident Evil, Final Fantasy, Tekken, Tomb Raider, Metal Gear Solid, and so on. Even their mascot, Crash Bandicoot, was owned by Universal Interactive. For all their faults, Nintendo have always made sure that the games most associated with their systems are things that they own, and that they have an ironclad grip on their intellectual property. But that didn't help Nintendo as they were trounced by the PlayStation in the 5th generation of games, and later the PlayStation 2 in the 6th generation of games. Why can't I say 6th? The 6th generation of games was an era wherein Sony's success with the PlayStation hinged on third parties more than ever. But that didn't harm them in any way. It was a console with an install base of over 150 million users by the end of its life, outselling the GameCube something like 6-1. So Sony could comfortably rest on their laurels and not worry about the specifics of their success, but that doesn't change the fact that when you look at the best-selling games for the console, once again, most of the hit games were not specifically PlayStation-made IP. Gran Turismo being the exception because for whatever reason, driving games have this massive fan base that I've never seen or heard from. Probably because the fan base doesn't spend a lot of time on the internet. But as far as Sony IP with actual characters, only 3 of the top 20 best-selling games were theirs. 2 of which being God of War games, and when you bump that up to the top 30, it only bumps it up to 5 games in 3 franchises, whereas if you take a look at the best-selling GameCube games, you see a much different story. 24 of the top 30 best-selling GameCube games were Nintendo IP, so while the install base for the GameCube was significantly smaller, you had a customer base that was extremely loyal to Nintendo and their various franchises, which made things like Super Smash Bros. Almost a no-brainer. And that's the main difference between something like the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. The PlayStation 2 had a much bigger user base, but they didn't have the loyalty to Sony or their intellectual property in the same way that die-hard Nintendo fans did and continue to have to this day, meaning Sony didn't have much of an incentive to commission the creation of intellectual property, nor market them as well as they could, which therein lies the core of the issue. Essentially, the PlayStation's success was down to that casual user base, but the thing about the casual user base, which companies have had to learn and relearn throughout history, is that all you need is one slip-up and you can and usually will lose the casual customer. And Sony, after 2 banger consoles in a row, couldn't help but get complacent. Hence, when the PlayStation 3 initially came out, it flopped hard, because the PlayStation 3 was expensive and clunky, both for the user and the developer. Honestly, Sony initially dropped the ball so hard with the PlayStation 3 that had Microsoft not so epically dropped the ball with the Xbox One initially, and their biggest other competitor outside of the PC wasn't the worst-selling Nintendo home console of all time, the PlayStation brand may never have been able to fully recover. When it comes to the mass casual audience, you basically have 2 demographics. You have the audience looking for mature games, the kind of people who will play insert massively popular game here for a few hours after getting home from work. The other is families looking for wholesome entertainment for them and their kids. The hardcore audience is a little bit harder to pin down, but the hardcore audience, while generally being more dedicated, is and has always been a minority. The point is, PlayStation lost both of these demographics of casual fans in the early 7th gen, which was their bread and butter, leaving them essentially with only the most hardcore PlayStation fans, the ones who were around specifically for the exclusives. But the degree to which the PlayStation 3 initially flopped proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the intellectual property that PlayStation had at its disposal at the time was not strong enough in itself to carry a console in the same way that Nintendo's intellectual property might. They didn't have the notoriety, longevity, or iconography to compensate. While they were fighting to get back to a competitive level, they continued to represent their IP that could still turn a profit and create new IP, trying to connect to various audiences to varying success, but a lot of it was still being trounced by Nintendo's first-party offerings as well as big third-party offerings, with one notable exception. Their #1 early unequivocal success in this era was Uncharted, and I think that's what really gave Sony the first inclination of where to take their brand, because in the span of time between the beginning and the end of this generation, Uncharted started outperforming Sony's previous flag bearer as far as most popular exclusive IP, that being God of War, with Uncharted 2 and 3 both outselling the best-selling God of War game, that being God of War 3, by over 1 million copies apiece. Incidentally, before anybody says it, best-selling God of War game at the time. I think Uncharted was kind of the watershed moment that gave them a prototypical look at what they should be aiming to do. Because I think when you take a look at the history of Sony's flagship exclusive IPs, it kind of shows a linear evolution that more or less matches the evolution of what the mass audience wanted, going from the outlandishly cartoonish Crash Bandicoot to the slightly less cartoonish Jak and Daxter to the fantastical but somewhat grounded God of War, and then Uncharted took the flag, which further grounded things in such a level of reality that we were literally just in the real world now. One where you mowed people down by the truckload, but still. And that's the linear point of evolution that we found ourselves in when PlayStation All-Stars came out. They had the zeitgeist of their eventual identity, but they hadn't struck out yet. So the IP that they had at their disposal largely consisted of properties from previous eras, much of which never really found the audience that they maybe could have, either from not really appealing to a mainstream audience for whatever reason, or from a lack of promotion, or hell, maybe PlayStation's offerings never attracted a loyalist demographic the same way that Nintendo's games did. Then you had the ones that at one point had a large profile, but their notoriety had since faded, such as Jak and Daxter, which was a top 30 seller on the PS2, but hadn't had a game in a number of years at that point, and 2 of the last 3 games flopped hard. So what they had was a bunch of franchises nobody either knew about or really considered iconic outside of the small, dedicated fan bases. Things that in any sane world wouldn't be anything more than a B-tier inclusion at best. And even then they had to push it. I mean, you have Fat Princess in this game. Truly the Drew Carey of this Hall of Fame. To this day, I still have not seen a single second of gameplay of that entire game. As far as recognizable intellectual property at this point in time, they pretty much had Uncharted, God of War, and Ratchet & Clank. And maybe Infamous. Even Ratchet & Clank was debatable by this point, so that's certainly not enough to fill up an all-star roster for a fighting game. Mario at this point is probably more well known than Mickey Mouse, so you can slap his face on anything and it would be instantly recognizable. Aside from Mario, Zelda and Pokemon alone were significantly more well known to most audiences, casual or hardcore, than any first-party PlayStation property at the time. Regardless of what you prefer, this is undeniable. Not all of Nintendo's intellectual property is that well known, but they have enough that they can fill up a roster of well-known characters supplemented by lesser knowns, and that right there is what the essence of these types of games are. It's not about realistic versus cartoony or old versus new, it's about having enough to justify the roster. Something Nintendo had and Sony simply demonstrably didn't. All because of their philosophies during the PlayStation 1 and 2 days of, whether deliberately or otherwise, allowing their success to be hinged on factors external to them. So with that, there was one more thing up Sony's sleeve, the ever-reliable third party. But instead of doing what Nintendo did, using third-party characters to supplement their roster, Sony had to rely on third parties to bolster their roster, many of which were being used to cynically advertise upcoming games. In that category, you had the likes of Dante from DMC Devil May Cry or the Metal Gear Rising version of Raiden, and isn't that just the cherry on top? I know it's been said 1,000 times, but getting Raiden instead of Solid Snake is practically representative of the entire game. Though to be fair, I do like Raiden and Metal Gear Rising. On top of that, a lot of the third-party IP that were most associated with the PlayStation brand were not included for one reason or another. Cloud Strife, Alucard, and Crash Bandicoot being the three biggest examples of this in my opinion. Maybe they had the misguided impression that the novelty of a PlayStation crossover in itself would be enough to sell the game on, so they could theoretically skimp out on everything else. I'd imagine Cloud Strife or Crash Bandicoot would be extremely expensive to license, so they didn't even bother. But they learned the hard way that it takes more than novelty to be a successful Smash clone. So in the end, PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale was a failure, but it really never had the chance to be anything but. There was just so much working against it. History, budget, timing, everything. Despite its interesting ideas like a multi-level finisher system that required an offensive playstyle as opposed to Super Smash Bros, which often rewarded a defensive playstyle, story modes that tied into each respective universe, and a rivalry system that pitted major characters against one another, the sales and reception was extremely, well, mid for the lack of a better term. It was largely considered nothing more than a pretender trying to hone in on the success of Super Smash Bros. With a roster and overall quality far too weak to compensate for its shortcomings or its appearance of a cynical cash grab. Something they made no real effort to dissuade. However, like I said at the top of the video, I think this wasn't an idea without merit. It was simply the right idea at the wrong time. There was a time when a lot of the franchises it was representing were a lot more fresh, that the concept could have worked, but I think within the past 5 years or so, the ground has become incredibly fertile for something like this. Even though 2012 might have been somewhat of a low point for them and their intellectual property, that was then. And since then, PlayStation has had something of a rebuilding of sorts. I'm not too up on how corporate hierarchies work or how corporate decision making is done. This may have been a deliberate choice where some executive took a look at the books and decided that this is what they were doing, or there could have just been a series of creative people independently making and pitching what they wanted to do and everything just working out. But over the following several years, there was a renaissance of established PlayStation IP. There was a transitional period over the next year or two where the old guard was sort of phased out, and since then each respective company has continued to stake their claim with new intellectual property that have each become iconic and well known to a mainstream audience. Horizon, Returnal, Ghost of Tsushima, and most of all, The Last of Us. That being a massive monumental success, instantly becoming one of the best-selling games on both the PlayStation 3 and 4. The Last of Us continues to be a juggernaut despite being divisive, especially with the recent TV show. Plus, I'm sure there's more new IP in the works as we speak. Then there's their continued efforts to revitalize their established IP, regardless of if you consider them good or bad. God of War has always been a big franchise, but now it's reached heights beyond even what the series was at the height of the Greek saga, and it's an incredibly reliable success. It's been a while since we've seen Uncharted, but Uncharted 4 was potentially the best-selling PS4 game overall. It may have been the intended final entry for Nathan Drake, but I doubt we've seen the last of the series. Even Ratchet & Clank has risen far beyond the doldrums that it found itself in come the early 2010s. Matter of fact, while it's only a once-in-a-generation outing, each subsequent game is now far more successful than the last. That's not even to mention things that they've published but don't necessarily own, like Marvel's Spider-Man or Bloodborne. Of course, not everything they've touched has been a wild success. Days Gone and Gravity Rush 2 were two games that existed on opposite ends of the spectrum tonally, and they both flopped pretty damn hard. Then the attempted revitalization of the Little Big Planet IP didn't do so well, although I had no idea that it was even on PC until it was announced that it was flopping on PC. You can argue about whether or not this is all a good thing, because a lot of people simply don't like the quote-unquote Sony-style game, especially in retrospect, but I think to me it represented a shift where the PlayStation was able to start finding its own identity, somehow merging the casual and hardcore demographics. Games that struck the perfect balance of mechanically deep and with enough personality that a hardcore audience could enjoy it, while also being accessible enough mechanically and story-wise to a casual audience for them to enjoy it. And the sales figures reflected this. They were able to bridge the gap between the two extremes, and that is what became of their identity over the following generation and beyond. The overall point is, in the decade after PlayStation All-Stars came out, various subsidiaries of PlayStation created a reliable lineup of their own intellectual property that are well known and successful, regardless of what you think of their quality. Now that's a turnaround. Of course, it can be argued that they've only really made a handful of these transcendent franchises, but to that point, there haven't exactly been many new franchises from their other competitors in the same span of time. And that right there is why I think this is the time to make another crossover game, because now they have a roster of intellectual property that they didn't have in 2012. One that can carry a crossover game like this. You have the big heavy hitters, the classics, the hidden gems, and you could even throw in some third-party representation there. If they were ever going to make another PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, now is the right time to do it. Now, this is of course not without its problems conceptually. The biggest problem in the way of a PlayStation crossover event is that modern-day first-party PlayStation IPs generally take themselves fairly seriously, especially the most well-known ones, where Nintendo games tend to skew more towards a lightness of tone. Even things like Bayonetta, which are more mature experiences, have a sense of humor about themselves. A lightness of tone lends itself to a crossover-style game because a crossover is an inherently silly thing, so you need to present it with tongue firmly in cheek, otherwise you'll hit a tonal uncanny valley wherein the waveform will collapse and the entire thing will become incredibly uncomfortably surreal. I just can't envision a scenario wherein Jin Sakai interacts with Aloy or Ellie Williams interacts with Sackboy and the whole thing not look absolutely absurd. That begs the question if they could even do a story mode in these types of games the same way they could with more larger-than-life characters, because how do you contextualize a crossover happening with characters from a more grounded setting? Or would they just eliminate story altogether and hope the tone doesn't clash too much when you eliminate context? Theoretically, they might be able to pair up characters who come from similar worlds, pair up the fantasy characters with other fantasy characters, contemporary characters with other contemporary characters, the platformer characters with other platformer characters. Maybe you can even split those off into old school and new school. You can even have chunks of characters that occupy the same tonal space have their own mini story mode, or you can just go the maximum chaos route and go hell for leather with the most anarchic story you could possibly tell, where you just throw this melting pot of characters into the same space and see what happens. That would probably end up being somewhere between amazingly fun and horribly cringeworthy depending on your perspective, and depending on how well they handle it. I don't know, I'm not a game developer. Each direction has its ups and downs, so I can't say for sure which is the best way to go. But then it's also worth discussing what kind of game it would be. I think you could easily have a Smash-style event, but it also doesn't necessarily need to be a platform fighter. I know that Nintendo has essentially established the platform fighter as the basic model that all crossover games should follow, but they've also kind of cornered the market in that regard. I mean, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has sold over 30 million copies at time of writing. That's more than the population of Australia. Meanwhile, other platform fighter events have come and gone constantly, most notably that Nickelodeon crossover game that was dead on arrival, and then Multiverses, which was actually pretty solid and I genuinely enjoyed, but then they hot-shotted a lot of content and once they ran out, there was a severe drop-off in the player base. So it's not exactly something worth taking the chance on given the batting average of the entire industry. But I personally believe that they don't have to go with the de facto crossover style. I honestly think it would be better if they just struck out and did their own thing rather than sticking to what's successful. Capcom, for example, has a few separate styles for crossovers, like Marvel vs. Capcom or the other Street Fighter crossovers they've done. They also have Project X Zone, which according to the wiki is pronounced Project Cross Zone. I'm not sure which is more awkward to say, so it's already been established that this type of thing doesn't need to abide by one genre. The question remains though, what kind of game would this be? I guess that's the challenge for the comment section. Come up with a uniform genre that can encompass all these different games, genres, and tones. Personally, I'm stumped, but there's a reason why I'm not in the industry making games, aside from my vast incompetence. Aside from that, let me know what your ideal roster would be. Mine would be something like this. Now, keep in mind, this is my ideal roster. I'm fully aware that especially with third-party characters, some of this is unrealistic, but that's why it's an ideal. I'm personally okay with them going with a slightly smaller roster because I think Nintendo's quantity over quality mindset has resulted in me losing interest in Super Smash Bros. Ever since Brawl. I wouldn't expect a game like this to risk it with an exceptionally large roster anyway. So I capped mine at 50, but I also arranged them by priority in case some of them need to be cut to get the roster down to 40 or 30. The ones that were least likely to get in, or were second or third characters in franchises that already had representation, were ones that had lower priority. And then after that, it was just a matter of popularity and iconic status to a mass audience, with some extra scrutiny put onto the third-party characters with the knowledge that they would be already harder to get in by default. So that's my take on the topic. The time is ripe, and all we need is the right game. So if you like what I do here and want to help out with the channel, feel free to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification icon. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct way, you can donate to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards, including early access, exclusive content, and Discord benefits, like these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to users FarmCat84, Joseph Rosas, Raaf, Bettch, Nicholas Pino, Leyabout, Brooklyn, and Gaw004 for going above and beyond. Now, before I do my usual outro, I just wanted to briefly address something. When I first came up with the idea for this video, I was made aware that user The Golden Bolt made a video on the topic already, and I was also made aware that he had beaten me to the punch on a lot of what I had to say in this video. To the point that I was honestly considering scrapping this video altogether. I talked to TGB about it, he gave me the blessing to make my own take on it, and I went out of my way not to watch his video because I didn't want to have it inadvertently affect my own video, whether that be through subliminally implanting ideas in my head, or for me having to deliberately avoid certain topics because he'd already covered them. I wanted this video to be completely natural, but he is a friend of the channel, so I recommend going and checking his video out if you like my take. I'll put the link to that in the description. He certainly doesn't need my help, but I just wanted to pay it forward. With that said, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!